Chapter 6, The Early Tudor Scene. The historian of 16th century English culture is liable to find himself devoting all his space to charting the different ways in which that vast complex of movements which we call the Renaissance affected men's minds and imaginations. But in a history of literature one must resist the temptation to dwell at too great length on the intellectual background, important and fascinating though it is, and let the works of literature tell their own story. We have already said something of the new interest displayed by the humanists in the cultural monuments of Greece and Rome. Humanism had many aspects: the scholarly, concerned with the recovery or reconstitution of accurate texts of the classics; the stylistic, concerned with classical rhetoric and literary criticism and their application to an improved vernacular literature; the ethical, concerned with the highest ideals of Greek and Roman thought, which could be combined with or modified by Christian teaching; and what might be called the positively secular, the replacement of a theocentric universe by one based on man and his potentialities. The acceptance of human life and human values as of permanent significance if ordered and controlled by a sense of proportion, interpreted in the light of the best thought of antiquity, and enriched and illuminated by the arts. It would be difficult to find a writer who was influenced by all these aspects of humanism simultaneously. Many of the most active humanists were pedantic and narrow in their view of classical purity, and in their exaltation of Ciceronian Latin. But the 16th century French essayist Montaigne, secular-minded, but not anti-religious, curious about and tolerant of human foibles and attitudes, continually fascinated by the problems posed both by his own psychological and physical self and by the external world, called perhaps be taken as a typical representative of the humanist attitude in the broadest sense of that term. It was an attitude which found no such single typical representative in England, yet the attitude was influential in England. It was in the air, and people were touched by it and had to reckon with it. The influence of the new geographical discoveries on men's imaginations, though it developed later than one might have expected, is one of the more obvious points to be noted. Spencer can speak for that when, justifying in the prologue to the second book of the Fairy Queen his setting the scene in Tilda, that happy land of Fairy, he observes, "But let that man with better sense advise, that of the world least part to us is read, and daily how through hardy enterprise, many great regions are discovered, which to late age were never mentioned. Who ever heard of Th. Indian Peru? Or who in venturous vessel measured the Amazon's huge river now found true? Or fruitfulest Virginia who did ever view? Yet all these were, when no man did them know, yet have from wisest ages hidden been, and later times things more unknown shall show." And John Donne addresses his mistress with, "O my America, my new-found eye, and how blessed am I in thus discovering thee." It was Donne, too, who, in often quoted lines, expressed the effect on many men's minds of the new astronomy and new philosophy calls all in doubt. The element of Lyra is quite put out. The sun is lost, and though earth, and no man's wit can well direct him where to look for it. The new astronomy was made necessary by the navigational needs of the voyagers, and the voyagers themselves began by seeking for a new route to the spices of the east after the land route had been blocked by the fall of Constantinople. And spices were necessary in order to preserve the cattle killed in the winter, and the cattle were killed in the winter because no winter cattle feed was yet known. So the complex chain of cause and effect keeps on expanding. Further, the new astronomy depended on the work of the humanists. The notion that the Earth is a planet revolving round the Sun had been put forward by the Greek astronomer Aristarchus, BJI, Amos in the 3rd century BC. And Copernicus was first led to consider such a view by reading in a work attributed to Plutarch that the Pythagoreans had taught it. The editing and translating, into Latin, of Greek scientific works provides the bridge between humanism and science in the Renaissance. New geographical, astronomical, philosophical, and religious notions boil up and mingle in the most diverse ways throughout the 16th and 17th centuries. The new concept of the national state was helping to alter the medieval view of Christendom. On the accession of Henry VIII in 1509, the court became the center of fashion and culture. And after the suppression of the monasteries, the great country houses, which were so often built with their wealth and even from their ruins, took over the patronage of the arts. With the art of printing flourishing, books proliferated and reached an ever wider public. Religious and political questions were debated in multitudes of polemical pamphlets. So that it might be said that printing made the new ideas socially important at a speed unprecedented in earlier history. The religious controversies that raged throughout Europe were heightened and exacerbated by the printing press. Other new ideas reached less far down the social scale. The new ideal of the gentleman, combining the alternative medieval choices of the life of action and the life of contemplation, was reflected in the Italian courtesy books, of which the most influential, Castiglione's Il Cortegiano, was translated by Sir Thomas Hoby in 1561, and other works of education that appeared all over Europe to teach, in the words of Milton's pamphlet on education, all the arts, both public and private, of peace and war. The Baconian view of the function of knowledge as the relief of man's estate, as control over nature rather than abstract metaphysical insight, was even more limited in its influence, but it was nevertheless part of the intellectual climate. And with the establishment of Queen Elizabeth's court, with its mystique of the Virgin Queen, its patriotic self-confidence culminating in 1588 with the defeat of the Spanish Armada, and the growing sense of pride in the vernacular and its potentialities, the scene was set for a remarkable efflorescence of national culture. All this, of course, is to simplify. The literary pattern to be set against this background can be traced more adequately if we go back and inquire about the state of poetry in the reign of Henry VIII. George Putnam, the Elizabethan critic whose Art of English Poesy appeared in 1589, tells us in that work that in the latter part of Henry VIII's reign, 1509–47, sprang up a new company of courtly makers, poets, of whom Sir Thomas Wyatt the Elder and Henry Earl of Surrey were the two chieftains, who, having travelled into Italy and there tasted the sweet and stately measures and style of the Italian poesy as novices newly crept out of the schools of Dante, Ariosto and Petrarch, they greatly polished our rude and homely manner of vulgar poesy from that it had been before, and for that cause may justly be said the first reformers of our English metre and style. Wyatt, also spelled Wire and Wyatt, was the older of the two, living from 1503 to 1542, and in one sense it can be said that with him modern English poetry begins. He and the courtly makers who followed him exercised the language by translating from foreign models and experimenting with a great variety of lyric measures, to restore to English metrics the combination of flexibility and regularity which they had lost in the century following Chaucer. A century during which the rapid shift from that stage of the language we call Middle English to the stage we call Modern English had wrought havoc with the polished and controlled Chaucerian line. They were thus essentially craftsmen, treating a conventional subject matter over and over again in their attempts to hammer out a disciplined yet flexible poetic style. They borrowed, imitated, and translated from Italian and French poets as well as from one another, and had they not done so their ultimate achievement would have been less. They circulated their work in manuscript. Publication during the poet's lifetime was not at this time common, and engaged in mutual encouragement and criticism. In 1557, After the death of both Wyatt and Surrey, the printer Richard Tottel put out a collection of poetry by the courtly makers, with the title Songes and Sonnets. Written by the Right Honourable Lord Henry Howard, late Earl of Surrey, and other, generally co-known as Tottel's Miscellany, which was a somewhat belated manifesto of the new poetry. Many more collections of songs and poems followed in Queen Elizabeth's reign, 1558 to 1603, bearing such attractive titles as The Paradise of Dainty Devices, A Gorgeous Gallery of Gallant Inventions, A Handful of Pleasant Delights, A Banquet of Dainty Conceits, The Arbour of Amorous Devices, Englander's Helicon, and Englander's Parnassus. Many of the poems in these collections are little more than exercises. Some are over-ingenious, some crude and mechanical. But by and large they demonstrate the immense success with which the earlier poets of the century had flexed the muscles of the English language to make it suitable for graceful poetic expression. Some of Wyatt's most interesting, though not his most successful poems, are his sonnets. Like Chaucer, he had been sent on diplomatic missions abroad, and had visited Italy among other countries. To come, as so many poets in Italy and France had already done, under the spell of the 14th-century Italian poet, Francesco Petrarch, the great master of the sonnet of idealized love. He sonnet, one of the most popular verse forms not only of Elizabethan literature in England but of Renaissance European literature as a whole. Developed first in Italy in the 12th century before passing into France and then into England. Wyatt, facing the problem of restoring gravity and cogency of utterance to English verse after a period of linguistic change during which pronunciation had altered and metrical patterns had gone to pieces, turned to the Italian sonnet for help. Here was a highly conventional verse form, a form which demanded discipline and craftsmanship on the poet's part. A form which challenged the poet to mold his thought with wit and aptness to the precise shape of those 14 balanced lines. The sonnet was not simply a stanza of 14 lines with a certain rhyme scheme. The lines were deftly balanced, the links and pauses between them creating a movement which, in most Italian sonnets, was in 4 parts, 2 of 4 lines each, quatrains, and 2 of 3 lines each, tercets. There were other ways of balancing the sonnet, such as Shakespeare's. He balanced it on a final couplet of rhyming lines, but the pattern most common in Italy employed 2 quatrains with a single pair of rhymes, ABBA, ABBA. The first and fourth rhyming and the 2 middle lines rhyming, as in Tennyson's In Memoriam, followed by 2 tercets in any one of a variety of arrangements CDC, CDC, or CDC, DCD, CDA, CDA, or other groupings. In SNCH a scheme, the 4 parts of the sonnet really resolve themselves into 2. The first consisted of 2 pairs of 4 lines, the octave, and the second of 2 pairs of 3 lines, the sestate. There were many other ways of patterning the 14 lines, but the pattern just described was that most frequently used by Petrarch, whose sonnets celebrating his ideal love of Laura were immensely influential and represent the most important single influence on later love sonnets throughout Europe. There are periods in the history of any literature when what poets need most is a formal convention which will enable them to study the demands of the medium quite objectively, with a craftsman's eye, and prevent them from merely splashing about in language that has not been tempered to meet the precise curve of the meaning. The sonnet form met this need for English poets in the 16th century. And Wyatt's sonnets represent one of the most interesting movements toward metrical discipline to be found in English literary history. Wyatt's problem was to handle the 10-syllable iambic line with gravity in the individual line and at the same time to achieve a significant unity in the poem as a whole. The metrical tradition established by Chaucer had lost its usefulness because of changes in the language. While these changes, which brought with them a certain hexability in accentuation during a transitional period, made it possible for Wyatt to experiment freely and effectively in numerous short line stanzas where the sustained gravity of regular metrical utterance throughout a series of long lines was not required. They seriously handicapped him in writing the heavier kind of line demanded by the sonnet. As a result, his sonnets are less good than his lighter lyrics. He is not always quite sure where the accent falls in a given word, nor is he always able to keep before the reader's ear the basic swell of the metrical design, so necessary in this kind of formal utterance. In the lighter lyrical measures he was also helped by the rhythm of lute mllsic. It was not only the sonnet form that later poets got from Petrarch. The whole nature of the relation between the poet and his beloved became conventionalized in terms of an idealized courtly love attitude which Petrarch manifested toward Laura in his love sonnets. This notion of the lover as the humble servant of the often cruel fair, wounded by a glance of her eye, tempest-tossed in seas of despair when his love is rejected, changing in mood according to the presence or absence of his beloved, is derived from the medieval view of courtly love which we have discussed in an earlier chapter. Petrarch moved this courtly love to a high, ideal plane of his own, and subsequent sonneteers for the most part kept it there. The Petrarchan sonnet thus provided the English poet with both a conventional form and conventional sentiments. It should be added that innumerable Italian and French sonneteers after Petrarch had helped to conventionalize both form and content by the time the English sonneteers began writing. The difficulties Wyatt found in handling the iambic pentameter line in the sonnet can be illustrated by the opening line of the following sonnet, from Petrarch. Ever min happy as slack and slo in coming, desire increasing, tnyn hope uncertain, that leave it or yt it doth me like pain, and tigra like, as swift it is in parting. Wyatt's own spelling has been retained, because to modernize it is often to prejudge the question of pronunciation. The third line here has 10 syllables but in no other way resembles an iambic pentameter line. Uncertain, in TNE second line is accented on TNE final syllable. The verbal ing ending is apparently accented at the end of the first and fourth lines. Wyatt's rhyming of verbal endings such as ing and eth and noun endings such as ness and ounce is a common habit, and shows much awkwardness. In a line such as which holdeth the divine party of Natanre, it is uncertain whether nature is accented on the first syllable, as it certainly was by Shakespeare's time, or on the second syllable, as Chaucer pronounced it. The rhyming of nature with master hardly helps us to decide. Or the opening of another sonnet from Petrarch, the lunge love, that in my thought doth habe, shows how far from the iambic beat Wyatt could get. Or is this line meant to be scanned as an iambic pentameter? One is tempted to scan it the lunge love, that in my thought doth habe, with perhaps the a of lunge pronounced. But did Wyatt mean the long love, that in my thought doth habe? Or something between these two? Either way, doth is a monosyllable, though it is apparently disyllabic in other poems. The rhyming of habe with banner, banner, leaves the accentuation of both words still in doubt. And what are we to make of such a quatrain as this, from the same sonnet? She that me learneth to love and suffer, and willest that my trust and lust's negligence be reigned by reason. Shame and reverence, with his hardines taketh displeasure. Reason, is apparently pronounced like the modern reason, not like the Chaucerian resound, though no doubt Wyatt could pronounce it in the Chaucerian way if it suited the line. Displeasure is accented on the second syllable, one assumes, rhyming, if it can be called a rhyme, with suffer, yet it might just as easily be pronounced with the accent on the final syllable. The pronunciation of English was changing ever as Wyatt wrote. At the end of the remarkable poem beginning, they fie from me that so me time did me sake occur the lines. But since that I so kindly Arne served, I would fain know what she hath deserved. This scans regularly if we pronounce the a in kindly, and which Wyatt surely did not do in no. But Tottel, printing the poor ITL in 1557, amended these lines to but. Since that I unkindly so am served. How like you this? What hath she now deserved? This is neat and regular. But more than metrical changes have taken place. In the 20 or 30 years since Wyatt wrote, not only had it become impossible to pronounce kindly as three-syllable, it had also become impossible to construe so kindly in the sense that Wyatt had intended, meaning in such a fashion, and taught one had to change it to unkindly, thus giving a quite different force to the line. Sometimes we find in Wyatt remarkable effects of metrical subtlety achieved through cunning irregularity. But we never be sure whether the irregular tilde ity really is the product of cunning or whether the effect was not intended or whether, indeed, Wyatt scanned the passages we do. These difficulties, which are so apparent when Wyatt wrote the iambic pentameter line, seem to have largely disappeared when he wrote in lighter lyric meters, with, presumably, the help of music LLI accompaniment. There is nothing tentative or awkward about this. One can safely modernize the spelling now. Forget not yet the tried intent of such a truth as I have meant, my great travail, so gladly spent. Forget not yet when first began the weary life ye know. Since wan the suit, the service none tell can, forget not yet. Forget not yet, forget not this, how long ago hath been. And as, the mind that never meapt amiss, forget not yet. Forget not, then, thine own approved, the which so long hath thee so loved, whose steadfast faith yet never moved, forget not this. The same serene control can be seen in such lyrics as, marvel no more, and, my lute, awake. My lute, awake. Perform the last labor that thou and I shall waste, and end that I have now begun. For when this song is sung and past, my lute be still, for I have done. The refrain seems to help Wyatt, and his best songs are those balanced on the concluding short line refrain. Forget not yet, blame not my lute, say nay. Say nay. Yet these poems do not represent any startling new development in the English lyric. Their verse forms and rhyme schemes are often to be found in medieval Latin poetry and in Middle English lyrical poetry too. The Middle English lyrical tradition flows directly into the Tudor song tradition. And the reader who comes from 14th and 15th century lyrics to the songs of Wyatt is conscious of no break. A 15th century manuscript, for example, has the following poem. Women bathe God and skeen, beautiful on Hundays, fate, and face dene. Women may no better bene. Witness on Mary, women beth gentle on her tour. A women bear or a savior. Of all this world women is our witness on Mary. This is the exact stanza form of Forget Not Yet. The lively movement and metrical assurance of The Nut Brown Maid, first printed about 1502, shows all the virtuosity of later Tudor poetry. Its internal rhyming is handled with great artfulness, be it right or wrong. These men among on women do complain, humming this, how that it is a labor spent in vain, to love them well. For never a dilty, hey loafe a man again. For let a man do what he can, to her favor to attain. Yet if a knave to them pursue, to her first true lover then laboureth for naught. And from her thought he is a burnished man. This spirited dialogue between Squire and Puella runs on Fr 30 lively stanzas, each concluding with the phrase, burnished man. It seems clear that the sung lyric was not affected by the changes in the language that seems to have caused the iambic decasyllabic line to disintegrate. Skeltonics may represent a deliberate abandonment of metrical polish in favor of a rough, if effective, accentual measure, but while Skelton wrote, anonymous singers were keeping a smoother kind of verse alive so that it could be transmitted to later generations. Wyatt's most perfect poems are not, then, his most original in form. In subject matter, he is as a rule even less original. Content to appear in the conventional guise as the hopeless lover of a cruel mistress. Yet every now and again he handles the heavier line with a force and splendor that mark him as a pioneering original poet of extraordinary strength. Only a complete poem can illustrate this. They flee from me that sometime did me seek, with naked foot stalking in my chamber. I have seen them gentle, tame and meek, that now are wild, and do not remember that sometime they have put themselves in danger to take bread at my hand. And now they range, busily seeking with a continual change. Thanked be fortune it hath been otherwise. 20 times better. But once in special, in thin array, after a pleasant guise. When her loose gown from her shoulders did fall, and she me caught in her arms long and small. Therewith all sweetly did me kiss, and softly said, Dear heart, how like you this? It was no dream. I lay broad waking. But all is turned, thorough my gentleness, into a strange fashion of forsaking, and I have leave to go, of her goodness, and she also to use newfangledness. But since that I so kindly am served, I would fain know what she hath deserved. The variations from the regular iambic line here are strangely moving, and the whole poem has the air of having caught, and rendered into impressive art, the very essence of an emotional situation. Wyatt occasionally does this even in those sonnets where the handling of the meter seems to be a hit or miss affair. Surrey never achieves the strength and subtlety of Wyatt at his best. Wyatt's three satires, though derived from Horace, 2, and the Italian poet Alamanni, 1, have a freshness and a conversational tone which please in a different way. The first begins, Mine own John Pounds, since ye delight to know the cause why that homeward I me draw. And be the press or courts whereso they go, rather than to live thrall, under the awe of lordly looks, wrapped within my cloak, and the second my mother's maids. When they did sow and spin they sang sometimes a song of the field mouse.